faculty and grad students, with the idea of providing a document that really anybody, but particularly policymakers, could use to weigh decisions associated with nature-based infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. And of course, that's become more and more important as we continue to have large rain events as well as more hurricanes. We've got one that just formed, a tropical storm that has just formed this morning in the Gulf. So we'll be watching that closely, as we have several others this summer. And I am going to touch on some of the impacts from Hurricane Harvey, which was in some ways quite a big wake-up call for our region. And of course, all of this is associated with climate change. What Houston Wilderness generally does is we provide an environmental policy vehicle for business, nonprofit, and governmental entities to work together on a variety of different environmental issues. So we work mainly at a very large 50,000 feet scale, if you will, on very large initiatives, and I'll touch a little bit on that. But the idea behind creating this organization about 18 years ago was because we are very ecologically diverse. We have 10 distinct ecoregions in our area. And as you can see on this map, we have got waterways like fingers that run through the central core of this this very urban region that in Harris County, which includes the city of Houston and surrounding counties, you're looking currently at about 6.5 million people, and they're expecting at least 1 million, if not more, people to be moving in over the next year or so. And so it's very urban, and yet has a tremendous amount of ecological assets to it. And we weren't always particularly nice to those ecological assets in the past, but we have learned over the last 20 years that we need to be, and we've got to be, in order for this community to survive the various threats and stresses of climate change. So real quick, just to give you the 3 main areas of our ecoregions as opposed to going through all 10. We have our wetland marsh systems, which provide a variety of different ecosystem services. And let me point out that when I mentioned that second edition primer, you can find that on our website very easily, houstonwilderness.org, if you want to go more in depth on this document, not necessarily to learn what you may already know, but to see the way that we created it so that policymakers could learn enough to be able to make good decisions, but not get overwhelmed with all the science, which they're not really particularly interested in, just because they don't have time. But this is all very much science-based. We provide all the references associated where this information came from, but we concentrate on these 3 ecological areas and the ecosystem services they provide. So we have our prairie wetland areas along our coast and bays. We have a large amount of prairie system. It's vertisol soil, which I'll talk about in a minute, very clay-based, which some of the folks on this call can relate to. And that provides or presents a very unique set of opportunities and challenges associated with not only quantification of ecosystem services, which we're still working on with our prairie grasses, but also the way our prairies work. They don't absorb water the same way that non-clay-based soils do. They hold water longer. And so decisions are being made now that weren't made as strongly in the past, recognizing after Hurricane Harvey that we aren't going to have the absorption levels that some folks using benefit transfer data thought what we would have. And then we also have very thick forested areas, mainly full of pines, loblolly pines and other pines. And those areas, of course, also provide a unique set of ecosystem services. This is just a little bit closer up view of all those waterways that run through like fingers through our region. And then they empty out into either Galveston Bay, which then empties into the Gulf of Mexico, or down our 3 major rivers in this area, again, either into the bay or straight into the Gulf. This provides you with just a little data on our soil makeup, which again becomes very important when looking at nature-based infrastructure and size and use of our various lands for purposes of resilience and creation of additional nature-based infrastructure. So our main soils are alpha soils and vertisols, and the vertisols are the areas, as you can see in the blue, are the main predominant areas in our region, which means basically we're dealing with a clay pan at about 12 inches below our topsoil. So it's an interesting challenge, but we're working through it. So I want to talk real quick about Hurricane Harvey. Most everybody has heard about this hurricane. It's become fairly infamous because it did what the recent Hurricane Sally did to Alabama and the panhandle of Florida just over the last few days, and that is we didn't actually get the hurricane. The hurricane actually came in south of us, in quite a bit south, miles south of us. But what we got was the backside of that hurricane, and it stalled over our region for days. So this is just one example of one of those waterways that I showed you. Not all our waterways are concrete lined, but this particular one is. And you can see that Friday as the rains began, as we got that back end of Hurricane Harvey. And this is the next day, Saturday, and then Sunday. You know, we had in some places 52 inches of rain in some areas over just really a 3-day period. It was just a crazy amount of rain, and it was extremely devastating to the region. I was going to say extremely devastating to humans, which of course it was, and to property. But the other thing is it was very devastating to our environment. This was taken by NASA not long after that final day, so around Sunday, Monday, after those 3 deluge of rain days. And this shows you the amount of sediment because of lack of the type of nature-based infrastructure that we really need in our region. This is the sediment that ended up flowing downstream either through our rivers. You can see them very, very clearly. All that brown is not supposed to be showing up like that. And then in Galveston Bay, that should be blue. And of course it's not, because that's all sediment. And it took millions of dollars and many, many weeks and months in order to clean up all that. And of course it meant that the Houston Ship Channel was shut down for days. And that meant that commerce wasn't happening. So of course it affected us in every possible way. And we now recognize that we have got to do some major work and do it fast. So while I am mentioning this Ecosystem Services primer, which is being used, perhaps even more interesting than that are some of these case studies. Every single type of effort being done related to nature-based infrastructure in our region overlaps with aspects of this primer. And many of it is being done in a private-public partnerships because, as was just mentioned by Dr. Cook, you got to do it that way in order to have substantial impact. So the 6 key steps are the 6 key areas that and the guide that we use in the Ecosystem Services primer are: 1, to determine the nature-based infrastructure goals, which really has occurred pretty substantially already in our region, again, due to Hurricane Harvey. Understand the role of the various ecosystem services in decision-making. In other words, if you're looking at air quality, then what are where can you make that impact on ecosystem services? If you're looking at water absorption, erosion control, urban heat island effect, sea level rise, shoreline stabilization, all those various areas, understanding what different roles ecosystem services can play for you depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Establish the ecosystem services baseline of the area. We're way ahead on that with our native tree species, and we're way ahead of that on our oyster reefs and seagrasses. We are way behind on our prairie grasses, and so we're working on those ecosystem service baselines so we really can quantify what impacts we can have through nature-based infrastructure projects. And then evaluate the benefit relevant indicators. So that's become more and more important. It may be that the actual value you may not be able to get right away, but you can still look at what those benefit relevant indicators are. If a green space has been enhanced and less homes flooded in the most recent rain event, that's a benefit relevant indicator that indeed that green space is having an impact. So we also try to quantify that information. and allow the policymaker to think through those aspects of valuation too. And then consider regional and local challenges, not only current but future. What does the increase in temperature or longer periods of heat, what's that going to mean in terms of the nature-based infrastructure that you're trying to create or the species that you're using? And then lastly, using optimal ecosystem services valuations based upon what decisions you've made with the other steps. And I'll go through a little of that, although I'll have to go through it fairly quickly. Real quick, I want to mention that in this primer, we used the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. I know there's a lot of additional ones and they're very detailed, but this one for the policymaker is super easy to get your head around fast. And so we've just stayed with this MEA classification, and it works well. So with those 6 steps in mind, one of the first ones, as you saw, I mentioned the second step, we have the policymaker think through what the goal is, for instance, if it's prairie restoration or adding additional prairie land to help prevent flooding downstream, then an ecological function monitoring might make the most sense, and we walk through how that would work. It might be a spatial scale impact if we conserve 1 acre versus 20 acres or 20,000 acres instead of 100 acres. What is that impact? Do we think that's the goal? And we walk through what that would be. And then what are the outright losses? That's come up a lot since Hurricane Harvey. How do we, in fact, our flood control district actually looks at and makes decisions based upon how the percentage of homes it can save and the loss it can prevent by making the decisions they're making. And then a substitute equivalency is saying, well, we have this gray infrastructure, let's see if we can replace it with nature-based and get more benefit from that. And then building something new is what it sounds like. What will those impacts be, and how can we build it in a way that will be less harmful to the environment and the residents and businesses? Energy savings, insurance savings, property value, and cost of illness, all again different goals that might be in mind. And cost of illness comes up quite a bit actually in our more industrial areas where we've got higher asthma rates, higher cardiac arrest rates. We want to look at what are things we can do nature-based infrastructure-wise to help bring down air quality, provide less a cooling effect for the urban heat island, and that kind of thing. And then once you have those goals, then you can look through what methods of ecosystem service valuations you might want to use, and the primer walks through a lot of that. And I don't have time to, of course, go through all of that, but these give you, and I don't know if they're going to post, I know they have the presentation. If they post it, you'll have time to read more of these. But I've just kind of walked through the ecological function just now. This is a collaborative effort that really ties in with ecological function. This was business, nonprofit, and governmental entities coming together, over 100 different entities, and Houston Wilderness facilitates this 8-county effort. And it has 3 key goals for this 8-county region. To increase protected preserved land, we have the baseline for that data. We know that 14.7% of our 8-county region is protected and preserved in some way. That's it, 14%. And we want to reach 24% protected preserved by 2040. About 26.5% of the 8-county region is developed. So we've got a lot of room to work with. And there's about 18% of the region that is agricultural, which obviously we would expect to continue. And then the second goal is that 50% of the 8-county region have some kind of nature-based stabilization technique on it. So that's everything from bioswales, low-impact development, green stormwater infrastructure, large-scale tree plantings, and that's a lot. That's this 8-county region is about 4.9 million acres. So you're looking at 2.5 million acres of nature-based infrastructure. But you can do that. You can put bioswales on private property. It may not stay that way. It's not protected preserved land. It could be sold the next year and they could tear it up. But at least we could work toward as much of the or 50% of the region to have some type of technique. And because we have the major oil companies, Exxon, Shell, ConocoPhillips, BP, they have that on their campuses. They've got a lot of these nature-based nature-based stabilization techniques on their properties. So we're able to highlight those as best management practices, which of course is a win for everybody. And then lastly, the third key goal, which has already been touched on here, is we wanted to tie in what our region is doing with what's going on internationally with carbon sequestration. And of course, we're a high emitter because of our oil and gas industry in our port. So the goal is to increase by 4% annually in our carbon sequestration, organic carbon sequestration in our soils through large-scale tree planting. And we've got a variety of ways that we're working to do that. One of them is this project, which we're doing with the Port of Houston and Trees for Houston and other partners. And that is to plant over 1 million trees along the 25 miles of the Houston Ship Channel. We're super excited about that project, and we are planting trees this fall. We planted them last spring, and we'll keep doing so. And it's not just any native trees. We're actually targeting native trees that are high in these ecosystem services, high in air pollution absorption, high in water absorption, high in carbon sequestration. We've analyzed all the trees, our native tree species, and ranked them. And then we have taken basically the top 12, what we call the super trees, and that's what we're concentrating on planting in the millions. Direct market price is what it sounds like. Avoided cost method I've mentioned. Our Corps of Engineers for our Houston district is very, very supportive of ecosystem restoration projects. So yes, our region is looking at things like what they do in the Netherlands with gates across our bay, and that has its own billion-dollar price tag. But we're also looking at billions of dollars along our coast, looking particularly at how to deal with our very, very rapid sea level rise through ecosystem restoration projects. So that's an example of an avoided cost method. And then our replacement cost method, it's similar, I've mentioned that earlier. For mitigation and restoration, our flood control district for our region. We actually have an entire governmental department dedicated to that effort because of all the waterways in our region. They have begun a series of bonds, which in Texas is not an easy thing to necessarily get passed, but they've been able to pass a $2.5 billion bond, and they're working on a variety of projects to create things like this. This is now an existing nature-based stabilization technique, a water quality filtering feature, as well as a flood control amenity, as well as a park along our waterway. And there's a series of these that are being built along our waterways. I've mentioned the benefit relevant indicators, and we go through case examples of those. Anyway, you can find all this information in our Ecosystem Services primer, and I want to keep us on track, so I don't want to go over any more.